Hello and welcome to this video. In this video I'm going to talk about my trip to all the 50 US states, starting from the first time I visited the US until today. So enjoy the video. So the first state I visited was New York in 1999. And I actually went back to New York quite a few times after that. This was actually for a holiday, but I ended up working in New York on and off a couple of days a year until about 2002. I even worked in the World Trade Center for a little while. Now, part of my criteria for visiting particular states is that I have to do something in the state or stay overnight or something more significant. Driving through or flying through a state or landing in an airport in the state and transferring off doesn't count. So the first place that I actually landed in the US all the way back in 1999 was in Newark in New Jersey. But because I only transferred to New York with the rest of the people I was with, that doesn't count as a state visit. The next state that I visited was California, and visiting some friends who were in San Francisco at the time. Never been back to San Francisco, but that was the first time that I visited California. We made a brief trip to Las Vegas, so that signed off Nevada. The next state that I visited was Florida, which is a state that I haven't been to since. Spent a few days in Miami Beach with some friends before we flew to the Cayman Islands and transferred back. But it counts. So Florida is the oldest state that I haven't been back to. So you could argue that my 50 states visit actually started in January 2004. And in 2010, I finally got to actually work in Jersey City for a little while and stay in New Jersey. Then my trip to Virginia was staying in a place near Dulles Airport overnight. So again, not the best. I didn't really get a chance to see what Virginia was really like. But again, it counts. I also went to Washington, D.C. on that trip, and I went to Arlington. So you could argue that even from a visiting and attractions point of view, I've done, quotes, Virginia, because I went across to the Virginia part of Washington, D.C. But again, a lot of people would say that's not really the real Virginia, and they're probably right. The next trip that I went to was to Podcast Movement in Chicago in 2016. The next year, on my way back from Social Media Marketing World, I decided to break up the trip by staying in Boston in Massachusetts. And the weather was pretty terrible. It was snowing virtually all the time and it was really cold. But that was the first time that I ever visited Boston and got my early morning flight back from Boston to the UK. The next year, I decided to be even more ambitious with my trip back from San Diego for Social Media Marketing World. And I called it at the time the Swan Tour for San Diego, Wichita, Austin, and New York. Now, obviously, California and New York I'd already visited, but I'd never been to Kansas, and I'd never been to Texas. So, as I knew quite a few people from Wichita at the time, I went to visit Kansas, and it was nice to visit somewhere in the middle that a lot of people haven't been to. And that kind of ignited my interest in the more obscure states, because the flyover states are actually some of the nicest states and the nicest people that you can see in the US. Maybe there aren't the huge attractions there are on the coasts, but there's a lot to be said for the middle of the US. So visiting Texas, I was there in Austin for the famous South by Southwest event, which personally I found way too big, but I really enjoyed visiting Austin and all the museums in the Austin area. Later on that year, I went to Podcast Movement, which was in Philadelphia. I didn't really actually see much of Philadelphia because I didn't reserve much time outside of the conference for seeing Philadelphia, but I have been back since. Now, later on in that year, I did a longer trip going to Digital Book World in Nashville and also visiting Kansas City in Missouri. The next year, I actually was starting to count states and work them up, and I ended up going to Boise in Idaho, and that was an interesting trip because Boise in March is quite cold. It's not like stupidly cold, but it was definitely quite on the cold side. So that's where I was starting to learn the fact that, oh yes, it kind of does matter what time of year you go to particular parts of the US. I also went to Santa Fe in New Mexico, which is a lovely little city. In between March and August 2019, I committed to this goal I had of visiting all 50 US states before I was 50 years old, which was February 2023. So in August 2019, I did my first long trip to the US with the design of visiting as many states as I could. Now, this trip runs between August and September 2019, and in total I visited 6 new states. So I booked myself in to stay in Boston for about 5 days, and I decided I was going to take the Amtrak system and do day trips up. So on the first day I went up and got the train all the way to Maine, in Portland in Maine, and unfortunately the train was delayed by about 2 hours, so I had about an hour to walk to Portland, centre of Portland, from the station, which took about a quarter of an hour. So I literally spent about half an hour going into a Starbucks and walking around an art museum in Portland in Maine. Didn't really see much of the city. And then on the way back, I went to Dover in New Hampshire, where the train was perfectly on time and there was absolutely nothing to do in that particular city. 2 hours I had there. So I went to this very small museum. It's an interesting, quite nice little town in New Hampshire, Dover, but it's not somewhere I necessarily recommend anybody visit as a long-term destination. I did find a nature walk that was quite nice near the station though. The next day I went on a day trip to Connecticut. So I went to Mystic in Connecticut, which is a lovely waterfront town in Connecticut, very posh, and it's where the film Mystic Pizza was set, I believe. And from on the way back from Mystic, I went to Providence, Rhode Island, which is actually quite a nice city. It's a nice sort of Boston clone, mini Boston clone, but in Rhode Island. And it's got quite a few decent museums and universities and things there that you can visit. After visiting the Northeast states, I went down to a conference in Tennessee, and then I went down to visit some people I knew in New Orleans. Now, this was an extremely bad idea to go to New Orleans in September. I hadn't quite learnt the lesson about bad times of year to go to particular US states, but it was extremely hot and I was sweating like anything, so that was interesting. And then I went up to Georgia, which was actually reasonable weather in September, so up to Atlanta obviously in September, but it may be just because I went from New Orleans, it was stupidly hot, to Atlanta, which was just hot. But I did learn that you really want to visit the South in the winter months if you can, rather than in September. And it was lucky because there was no hurricanes at that time of year as well. which is another issue that you get from visiting the south potentially in the summer months. Then in 2020, I went and visited some friends in Phoenix in Arizona. Now, when I was there were all these rumors of this virus in China, and people were saying, oh, it's going to cause a lot of disruption to the Chinese economy. And there was a lot of coughing in airports and things as well. I can't really imagine. And then, of course, not long after that, everything's shut. Everything's shut. We were locked down in the UK, not even able to go anywhere, let alone the US. And then eventually that released up in early 2021. But the US, in their infinite wisdom, decided to only release UK travel in November 2021. So we couldn't really book anything or do anything in terms of the States. So this did kind of scupper my 50 states by 50 plan. So the next trip I did was one where I visited basically 8 states I hadn't visited before. And this was probably the first trip that I made, which was just purely about visiting states. Previously, I'd visited places where I knew people, but this was really just a trip to get states. So the first state that I visited post-pandemic was North Carolina. So I visited Charlotte in North Carolina and then did a day trip just over the border to a very nice town called Rock Hill in South Carolina. And from there I flew down to Mobile in Alabama, which has some really awesome museums and places. The city itself is a little bit run down, but again, this was post-COVID. I'm sure it's improved since. From Alabama, I actually got an Uber to Biloxi Beach in Mississippi. And again, Biloxi Beach is an interesting, like Las Vegas on sea, as they allow gambling on the seafront now because of all the incidents they had with riverboat gambling. They've moved to a system where they allow gambling on the seafront. So I visited Biloxi Beach and was surprised because Mississippi's got such a terrible reputation, but I actually quite like Biloxi Beach as a destination. Then I got a flight up to Arkansas and Fort Smith, which was on the border with Oklahoma. Fort Smith's an interesting little city in Arkansas. Lots of history, art, museums and things about the history of the Wild West and the frontier with Oklahoma, which was Indian territory at the time. And I did a very strange day trip to the Spiro Mounds attraction, which is the Native American burial ground in Oklahoma, and ended up on a bit of a magical mystery tour trying to get back from there. But I did visit Oklahoma on that trip. But again, Oklahoma's probably a state I should go back to see the real Oklahoma. After that, I ended up going to Social Media Marketing World, and on the way back, I flew to Philadelphia again, which obviously in the state I've already visited. But I did day trips from Philadelphia to Baltimore, so that's Maryland, and then down to Wilmington, Delaware, which has to be the worst state I've been to. Everything was shut, and it just isn't a particularly nice place to visit, Wilmington. It didn't feel unsafe as such, it was just really boring and nothing was open and there were no museums, and yeah, it was just a bit grim. So in August of that year, I had a huge trip planned. So I flew via Iceland to Seattle in Washington, and then the big one all the way up to Alaska. And I flew into Anchorage, spent a day there, and then got the Alaska Railroad up to Fairbanks in Alaska. And I would recommend the Alaska Railroad to anybody. I would have, in hindsight, have spent more time in Alaska, but it was so expensive because so many Americans were taking holidays in Alaska post-COVID in that particular summer that everything was just stupidly expensive. So I didn't really want to spend too long there, but I'm really glad I did go there, and I would like to go back probably June time, so to get the 24 hours of sun. Interestingly, Alaska in the summer is very similar to Britain in autumn time. It was kind of wet and drizzly. It reminded me of sort of October in England, August in Alaska. But it's such beautiful scenery and things to do up there. Definitely, probably would be the #1 recommended place to go outside of maybe possibly California. But it's a big commitment to go up to Alaska. So on the way back from Alaska, I went down via Seattle Airport actually on a very long flight to Portland in Oregon. And that's a nice city as well. Though there's a lot of homelessness, but they're not aggressive homeless people. Probably the most aggressive homeless people I came were in Anchorage in Alaska. But even though there are a lot of homeless people in both Portland and Seattle, they're not aggressive and they kind of leave you alone if you leave them alone. From Oregon, I flew all the way to Minnesota. Well, strictly speaking, I actually flew and landed in North Dakota in Fargo Airport, but my hotel was in Moorhead in Minnesota. I did visit attractions in Minnesota as well, on the Minnesota side of the river. So I stayed in Minnesota, but I visited Fargo and I landed in Fargo, and I do like Fargo as I said. I think Fargo is quite an interesting place to visit. Again, I was mindful that this was somewhere that I wouldn't want to visit in the winter. Both North Dakota and Minnesota famously have terribly cold winters. The next place I went to was Milwaukee in Wisconsin. Yeah, I like Milwaukee, there's a lot to do. Probably not the safest city. I didn't really go out much in the evening anywhere in Milwaukee. And there were some parts that were quite sketchy. But there's like the Harley-Davidson Museum, there's a really good art gallery, there's a really good public museum. There's a lot to see and do in Milwaukee. And generally seemed quite a friendly and nice place. From there, I actually went to Podcast Movement in Dallas, but again that's Texas. And then on the way back from there, I stopped over in Indianapolis for possibly the most pointlessly short trip I did anywhere. I arrived in Indianapolis at 4 o'clock on a Sunday and left at 12 o'clock on the Monday. And I discovered everything was shut because it was Sunday and but I had a nice walk around. It was the summer months. I had to walk around all the canals and things in the middle of Indianapolis, and it is a nice city. I didn't have any chance to actually really visit the place. The airport's quite nice as well. So Indianapolis is certainly somewhere I'd go back and do more than an evening on Sunday when everything was shut. Now, I actually went back for somebody's wedding in September in San Diego. And on the way back from that, I did a few more states. So this wasn't a proper state visiting trip as such, this was another trip. But on the way back, I went to Salt Lake City for 2 days. And I really enjoyed going to Salt Lake City. There's a lot of museums and things to do with the Mormon Church, which are interesting. The whole place is quite interesting, just because it's quite different from a lot of the US. And from there, I got a flight to Cincinnati Airport, which is actually in Kentucky, and went and stayed in Cincinnati. Cincinnati is a city that's had better days. You can tell that it's quite run down when you go and stay there, but there were a lot of good attractions in Cincinnati, and I would certainly recommend people visit it. The Kentucky side of the city, so Newport and the south of the river, which was the next state I went to, is a bit more up and coming, despite the fact that probably Kentucky has a worse reputation than Ohio, but the side of Cincinnati that's in Kentucky, so Newport, they're much more well-to-do than the Ohio side of Cincinnati, which is quite run down. By this point, I'd worked out that given the states I had left were all in the north, primarily, plus Hawaii, that I wasn't going to do my 50 states by 50 task. So what I decided was to just do it by my 51st birthday instead, which was a shame, because it would have been nice to celebrate my 50th birthday in Hawaii, but yeah, that wasn't possible. So next April, I started off by going to Vermont. I'd actually made more of a trip of this than I usually do. So on this particular trip, I'd already spent a week traveling up from New York City up via Nyack and Poughkeepsie in New York, and taking the train all the way up to Rutland in Vermont. And yeah, I met up with somebody in Vermont, and they showed me the nicer areas of Vermont, because I went to Rutland, which was a terrible place to pick because it's a bit of a dump in Vermont. It's not a nice city. But the rest of the state is lovely, and it's very mountainous, and probably after Alaska is probably one of the nicest states to visit. From there, I went back to Albany in New York, which was the state capital, but again, that doesn't count because I've already been to New York, and got a flight to Omaha in Nebraska. And Omaha is on the border with Iowa. There's a lot of things to see in the Omaha area. Omaha Zoo is probably the best in the US. And I went across the border to Council Bluffs in Iowa, had my photo taken with the Iowa sign. So Iowa is somewhere that I probably should return to at some point and actually visit Iowa proper. But I went to a museum in Council Bluffs. I had my photo taken with the sign. I ate something in a restaurant there, so it counts as a state visit. From there, I went and flew to Rapid City in South Dakota, which is quite near to Mount Rushmore. But as I discovered, it's actually quite hard to get from Rapid City to Mount Rushmore because none of the Ubers will take you to Mount Rushmore. So you need to take a tour. So I ended up looking at tours, and when I was there, I ended up unexpectedly finding that a tour company did a trip to Devil's Tower in Wyoming. So as part of that, I actually decided to do that tour, and I got driven all the way to Devil's Tower, which is the big monolithic sort of slab of rock that is in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It just stands up in the middle of nowhere when you're driving through Wyoming, and it's just this enormous slab tower, and it's called Devil's Tower. I'm really glad that I took the opportunity to do that day trip to Wyoming. From there, I went to Grand Rapids in Michigan. And that's a lovely little city actually. It's expensive, and I'm not sure if it was expensive because I picked a time. There seemed to be a marathon going on there at the same time, so it might have been that. But I got the feeling it's quite an expensive, affluent city. You've got Gerald Ford's Presidential Museum there, and quite a few other really good museums. I wasn't expecting much from Grand Rapids, but I was surprised. There's a lot of good attractions there. And then my final leg was I went to Charleston in West Virginia, which is quite a run-down city, to be fair. I know that West Virginia has had economic problems since the coal industry's decline there, but there was generally a feeling of decline in Charleston, West Virginia, which is a shame because it's absolutely beautiful, the nature around there on that river, and they could really do a lot more with it. But there's a usual issue in the US that rather than making good use of a waterfront, they'll build a massive 3-lane road down down the side of the river, and they did that for a large part of Charleston. There did seem to be a little bit of a fight back, but it was an interesting place to visit, and the state capitol building's quite nice in West Virginia. I've heard very good things about other parts of West Virginia, so again, that's somewhere I might well go back to. I wouldn't necessarily recommend going to Charleston in West Virginia. There are better places to go in West Virginia than Charleston. But if you're visiting US state capitals, it's not terrible. So that was the end of my trip in April 2023. And my penultimate visit to the US was as part of going to Podcast Movement in Denver. So it's actually quite an involved trip. I flew to Los Angeles, and then I got a flight up to Kalispell in Montana, and then got an Uber up to Whitefish. I was hoping to visit the Glacier National Park, but the temperature, there was a heat wave at the time, even in Montana, that made it like 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was just so oppressively hot that, given that it would involve me walking about 2 miles to get from entrance of the park into the park to get a bus, I was like, I'm just not going to do that. So I went to Whitefish, which is actually quite nice. There's a lot of trails and tracks even in the Whitefish area in Montana. It's a very posh part of Montana. There's a lot of rich people in that area who have holiday homes and the like. So I kind of felt like I saw Montana. Again, I probably want to go back to Glacier National Park and actually plan it properly and get a hotel in the park itself. But you need to book this like a year and a bit ahead. That seems to be the idea with the big US national parks. Or you get a car. So from Whitefish, got a flight down to Denver in Colorado, and some friends that I knew in Buena Vista were quite happy to invite me up into the mountains. I wasn't expecting them to, and I ended up staying a couple of days up with them at like 9,000 feet, which was interesting it was nice that I could acclimatise to that high altitude. And after that I went back down to Denver, which is only at 5,000 feet, I think. It's quite high, Denver itself. And went to Podcast Movement at a hotel near the airport. And from there I flew back to LA and spent a few days in Burbank. And that was the end of that trip. Now, originally I kind of thought I was going to do the Hawaii trip in November that year. I did actually go back to the US in November and went to Las Vegas. But ultimately I decided to go just before my 51st birthday in February 2024. And again, for a convoluted trip, which was to try and get me BA Gold status, which you can get if you fly in multiple jumps. It's very hard to get airline status if you fly direct to places, so you have to kind of jump around lots of different little flights all in one big flight package. So after 23 hours of flying, I ended up flying from Venice to Hawaii to finish my 50 states, and I was totally exhausted for most of the time in Hawaii. But highlights of Honolulu are Pearl Harbor is a fantastic attraction to go around. I'd certainly recommend you going to Hawaii just because it's a really interesting place, and there's lots of interesting museums and things about Hawaiian culture that I went to. So that is my 50 states. I'm now a visitor of all 50 states. I've still got a few US presidential museums to visit. I've got some states like Oklahoma and New Hampshire and Iowa where I kind of did them very, very quickly, and I'd like to go back. Probably like to go to somewhere like Minneapolis, some of the big cities I didn't go to. Houston I haven't been to. So there's still a lot to see and do in the US, though obviously I've now got the rest of the world to look at. Asia beckons. Asia and the Middle East are places I would like to go to. And also I'd like to get properly to Africa. I've been to Mauritius, which counts as Africa, but I've never been to mainland Africa. And I've never been to South America either. So I will keep visiting the US, but not quite as often. But I think if I have any conferences or events I'm going to the US, I'll take the opportunity to revisit a few places and maybe finish off the Presidential Museum.